What's up, guys? It's Ben Flight. Just wanted to do a little video for sort of intro to photography, because I was getting a lot of people asking me about newbie questions. They don't know what cameras to buy, what lenses to buy. Should I go full frame or APS-C? A lot of people out there just starting out. So this video is aimed at complete beginners who have no experience in photography. But if you're intermediate and you gain something out of this, maybe you missed something when you were learning the basics. Hopefully that'll help out as well. This video is going to be pretty in-depth and it's going to go pretty quickly. So if you need to watch it again or restart, rewind, do whatever you need to do, because I know it's a lot of information. It's pretty fast-paced. You probably won't absorb it all the first time. But what I really want to nail home is the essentials, the fundamental understanding of the technology and why you want to do things to achieve certain creative decisions. Because at the end of the day, no matter what camera you're using, what brand you're using, what lens you're using, it's all tools, and we have different tools for different situations. So your situation might not be the same as another person just starting out. You might be doing just stills or just doing video. You might be doing landscape photography, event photography, portraits, real estate. Whatever you're trying to get into, I'm going to try to give you the best tools for that job. And then maybe at the end I'll give a couple of gear recommendations or something. But I'm not going to go into specifics of brands and stuff, because I don't want to get in a culture war. There's a lot of people that are Canon versus Nikon versus Sony, whatever. And I don't believe in that elitism. I think whatever tool does the best tool for the job for you is what's gonna be the best for you. And there's a lot of stuff out there in any price range. Whether you're going for vintage, used stuff, or you're going for the newest camera, whatever your budget is, there's something for you. So let's get started. The first thing to probably know about photography, I would say, is the focal length of the lens that you're using. And that ties deeply into what we call crop factor. So a full frame camera has a crop factor of 1. What that means is you multiply the focal length by 1. So going forward in this video, I'm going to talk about different focal lengths being good for different situations. But just know that when I do talk about those focal lengths, I'm talking about the full frame equivalent. What that lens looks like on a full frame camera versus an APS-C camera, which would be another option for you to get. So we'll talk about why that's different in a second. But just going forward, I want you to know that the focal lengths that I'm talking about are specifically for full frame. The normal human vision, what we see the focal length of the human eye, it does vary person to person, so everyone's a little bit different, but the average is about 42 millimeters on a full frame camera. So if you are standing in a room and you want to see about the same field of view, minus the peripheral vision, about the same field of view as the human vision is, you would want a 42 millimeter lens on a full frame camera. Now, there are two very popular focal lengths that are incredibly versatile, that are within that sort of what we call the normal range, a normal lens. That would be the 35 millimeter and the 50 millimeter. They're incredibly popular, especially with cinematographers. Cinematographers love to shoot at 50 and 35 because they're so close to that 42 millimeter range that they tend to feel like normal human vision. They have the same sensation of being there. But the 50 obviously is a little bit more telephoto, as we'd call it, or the 35 is a bit more wide angle, so you actually catch more of the room. So those are two very popular focal ranges that I would say are probably the most versatile focal ranges that you can use for any genre, just because how close they are to our own human perception. That's not to say that they're useful for everything. Beyond what we call the normal range, on the telephoto end, and you can remember telephoto being close to telescopic. A telescope it sees things that are much, much further away, right? That's what a telephoto lens is good for. The more telephoto you get, the more that things in the foreground and things in the background seem to come closer together. There's a very good reason why you'd want to use a telephoto lens for portrait photography, because when we're dealing with wide-angle lenses, we are going to get more distortion, more of like the jawline sort of jutting out or the nose seeming bigger. And what a telephoto lens does is it sort of compresses the front of your face to the back of your jawline, and it creates this sort of focal compression that is really flattering, especially for women, especially for portraits, glamour photography. So a really popular focal range is anywhere from, like, of course, like the 50 on the normal end, but then you can go to like 80 or 100 millimeters, and that is really popular for glamour photographers, for fashion photographers, people who are doing portraits. It tends to make people look very beautiful. And another advantage is it tends to have a lot more, especially if you get a really fast lens, and we'll talk about what fast means in a minute. It can have some really nice bokeh, or bokeh, the sort of background blur, the depth of field that creates that nice creamy background that is out of focus. People love it for that reason. 80 millimeter, 100 millimeter, great portrait range. 50 millimeter as well is a really popular lens for portrait or glamour photographers. As you start to get past that range, you start to get into like the super telephoto lens. So I'm not actually sure technically where telephoto ends and super telephoto begins, but then you start to get like past 200 or 300 millimeters. And you get into the super telephoto area. What extremely telephoto or super telephoto lenses are very good for is less portrait photography. I mean, on sort of like the 100, 200 millimeters, it can still kind of be used for that. But as you get sort of past that or within that range, it becomes more useful for like event photography or sports photography or wildlife, things where you have a subject that is much, much further away and you need to like sort of zoom in on them or crop in on them and have them be a dominant part of the frame, and not have to get closer to them to do that. So for event photography, when you're shooting people on stage and you can't necessarily like get a backstage pass or something, you can't necessarily get closer to them because they're performing. That's really good. Another part of event photography may be just going through the crowd and taking pictures of people having a good time. You're doing more of like a portrait photographer kind of thing, like nightclubs. If you're working for a nightclub, you may just be taking pictures of the guests, and you may want more of like a portrait end of the lens. But in that sort of scenario, it may be good to get a sort of telephoto zoom that starts at like say maybe 70 millimeters to 200 or something like that, where you can quickly just switch between taking pictures of the band, which is far away, and taking portraits of people who are close up. So there's lenses that are designed to do sort of that range of purposes. Another way that you might use a telephoto lens would be for wildlife photography. If you're taking pictures of birds, if there's a tiger, you don't want to get close to a tiger, right? So you're taking pictures of something that is far away and you want to crisp and in focus, without having to get closer to it. So yeah, again, event photography, wildlife photography, sports photography. You can't get on the field with the players, right? So you have to be able to do it from the audience. You know, you can get good photos that are zoomed in on them. You know, so that's what telephoto is very good for. Another, you know, if you're at Comic-Con or something, I see a lot of people shooting Comic-Con at like 200 millimeters. You'll see on the lens it says a 200 millimeter if you go into the metadata on like Flickr or something, doing all the Comic-Con shots, or like shooting the Emmys where you don't want to get close to the celebrities. On the other end of things, on the wide angle ends, that tends to be very good for landscape photography when you want to get a wide sweeping vista. And the reason wide angle photography is really good for that as well, it is almost an absolute must for real estate photographers, because when you're shooting real estate, you want rooms to seem as huge as possible. Sometimes you're in a tiny apartment, and you want to make it seem as big as humanly possible so that people will want to buy it because they want bigger rooms, you know. So the wide angle lenses are very, very good for real estate photography. There is a specific wide angle zoom that that you will find that real estate photographers will swear by. It's the 16 to 35, I think f2.8L, and it is fantastic. It is, and the reason that they use that zoom lens of 16 to 35 is it encompasses this sort of wide angle zoom range that is very popular. I don't know a situation when you might want to go wider than 16. That started getting into like the super wide territory, which tends to be more and more towards like a fisheye lens. But that wide angle zoom range is just like the perfect amount. And not having to switch lenses when you're doing real estate photography. Again, that wide angle zoom is amazing. On the other side, on the downside from that, that is an incredibly expensive lens. It's like $2,000 for new, and maybe even like $1,000 used. So that is in a large investment. You know, that will probably, if you're doing real estate, that may be an investment you want to make that will last you your entire career, because it's the main lens you'll be shooting on probably. That kind of range is also good for landscape photography. It's going to be less useful if you really want to get one subject in landscapes, like if you're trying to focus in on one mountain range or you know, a tree in the distance or something to that extent. You may want to actually switch between like a wide angle for like the wide sweeping vistas and like a telephoto or a more telephoto lens, because of sort of different purposes. As the wide angle makes the angle seem wider and it makes more of the frame sort of visible in a single frame, more of the world visible in a single frame. The telephoto lens does the opposite, and it just sort of makes one thing seem bigger, which are sort of counter strategies. So if you're trying to make one thing in frame seem way bigger, when you're doing landscape photography, more of a telephoto lens is useful for that. If you're trying to make the entire surrounding seem all-encompassing and like make you feel small, that would be a wide-angle lens scenario. So again, different tools for different purposes, different techniques that create different feelings. As far as the pricing for lenses goes, you will be looking at spending a lot more the further you go from sort of the human range of vision. So, for instance, one of the most affordable lenses you can buy is what we call a nifty 50, right? A 50 millimeter 1.8. 1.8 is the aperture. We'll talk about that in a second. But it is one of the most affordable and best looking lenses that you can buy for the money. You know, you can get one for about $100. It is well worth it. As you start to get very telephoto, especially telephoto zoom lenses or wide-angle zoom lenses. The more wide angle you get, the harder it is to make glass that looks good. So you will find that wide-angle lenses can be incredibly expensive. You might find that a 35 millimeter might be $300, and that might be a good deal, or 24 millimeter, or if you're looking at stuff in the wider angle range, it can be quite expensive. Especially again, the zoom lenses. Zoom lenses tend to be far more expensive, at least when they're done right, than what we'd call prime lenses. Prime lenses are a fixed length focal length. Fixed length focal length for a lens. So a 50 millimeter is just 50, right? You could have an 85 millimeter prime lens that's just 85. When you get a zoom range, it has more optical elements. It has more pieces of glass, and it has more focal lengths that it has to look sharp in, more focal lengths that it has to be calibrated for. Because of that, it can look soft at certain focal lengths, especially if it's cheap glass. So sometimes zoom lenses, especially cheap zoom lenses, might not be worth the money because you might be getting really degraded quality because you're only getting cheap glass and it's not really well made. So this is one reason, and this is a perfect segue into why go full frame versus APS-C. And I know a lot of people will argue, there's a lot of people that are elitist about full frame, and there's a lot of people that are very defensive about APS-C. They think full frame users are brainwashed or something. I've gotten into arguments with people about it. I don't think it's that big of a deal. Again, different tools for different purposes. The purpose of a full frame camera is that it literally has a fuller frame. So the crop factor of a camera is literally going to be used as like a multiplier for that lens, right? So let's say you're working on an APS-C lens, and every APS-C for every manufacturer is going to have a little bit of a different crop factor. For Canon, it's 1.6. I believe Sony, it's 1.4. I might be wrong. Correct me in the comments if I am. The crop factor will determine what that focal length looks like on a full frame equivalent. So if you're shooting a 50 millimeter on a full frame camera, it's going to look like 50 millimeters. But if you're shooting it on an APS-C camera, it's going to look like an 80 millimeter camera, assuming you're on the 1.6 times crop. It's going to look like an 80 millimeter lens on a full frame camera. It's going to be the equivalent crop. It's going to look like it's sort of cropped in relative to the full frame look, right? So when you're actually going out and you're learning about this kind of stuff, you're learning about the different focal ranges and what they're useful for, most of the time people are going to be talking about full frame lenses, or at least the full frame equivalent of those lenses. So knowing the sort of the multiplier of your camera, the crop factor of your camera is important when you're shopping for lenses. This is why it's probably advantageous for people who are trying to shoot on the wide angle side of things to get a full frame camera. And I know some people are going to be yelling in the comments, but APS-C lenses are cheaper overall than full frame lenses. That is true, but wider angle lenses are more expensive than normal range lenses. So it does balance out. But at the end of the day, I find that investing in a good full frame camera is a one-time purchase versus investing in a bunch of wide-angle glass continues to have that sort of premium that you're paying for that. So when you are shooting on like a 35 millimeter, it's a wide-angle lens or wide-ish on a full frame camera, but it's essentially a little bit telephoto. It's a 50 millimeter equivalent on an APS-C camera. So even though you're paying for wide-angle glass, it's going to look telephoto. Versus, same thing like 24 millimeter, you end up having to get some pretty wide-angle glass to get the equivalent of a full frame if you're doing it for APS-C. which can end up a little bit pricey. Get the kind of body that is good for the purposes that you're using. If you're already shooting in sort of the telephoto range, if you're already shooting, portraits and stuff, and you have no use for wide angle, it may be a good idea to invest in APS-C because it's cheaper, it'll allow you to sort of push all of your lenses towards the telephoto range with that crop factor. Alternatively, you could invest in a camera like the one I'm shooting on right now, which is the new Canon R8. It has a crop mode, which utilizes just part of the sensor and essentially just is the equivalent of just having a APS-C sensor. So there is a 1.6 times crop mode that allows me to shoot as if it were an APS-C camera, without a degradation in quality, might I add, because it's actually a 6K sensor. It can downsample. Yeah, it's super fantastic to have 2-in-1 for that. Previously, I used to shoot on a full-frame camera and then use an APS-C in my bag, and I'd just switch them out, and that just sort of doubled up like the value of my lenses, because I could shoot a 50 millimeter on the full frame and have a 50, switch it over to the APS-C, have an 80 millimeter, and it just sort of doubles the value of how much utility those lenses will have and what scenarios you can use them in, without having to pay twice. Well, you pay twice for the camera, but so yeah, it's amazing to have it all in one camera, which is sort of a new feature that they're adding. But yeah, that's focal length, right? So the next thing I want to talk about is sort of the exposure triangle, as most people would call it. And I don't want to use that word because I feel like that confuses people that are just starting out, and they treat the exposure triangle as if it's all equal, but it's not. So the exposure triangle is sort of a balancing act between ISO or ISO, f-stop, which is aperture, measures aperture, and shutter speed. And it's sort of a balancing act in order to get a well-exposed image, because each one, in different ways, sort of controls how much light is entering the camera. And each one will have to be balanced off of each other in order to sort of get the right exposure, get something that's not overexposed or underexposed. So that becomes a balancing act. But the reason I want to emphasize that it's not an equal triangle is because ISO is different. ISO is the one. I would say ISO should be your last resort. It should be the last consideration of the exposure triangle in all cases, because it's not so much a creative decision, ISO, as so much as a digital gain that is applied to the signal after the fact to brighten an image up. For that reason, it's not really it shouldn't be a part of your creative decisions so much as a balancing act to support those creative decisions. So the first creative decision you might want to make is about depth of field. How much depth blur do I want in the background behind my subjects? Do I want everything in the frame to be tack sharp, or do I just want my subject to be tack sharp and then the background to be blurred out? That's what we call depth of field. And a shallow depth of field means more background blur. A shallower sort of range that is in focus. Now, the way to achieve very good, very shallow depth of field is to use a wider aperture. A lower f-stop is a wider aperture. And the other way to do that is to use a faster shutter speed. Using 1/3000th of a second will get you much, much more background blur than if you're using, let's say, 1/30th of a second. Another consideration will be the aspect of motion blur. Do I want my image to capture the sensation of motion, or do I want it to feel like it's stuck? a moment frozen in time. Time has stopped, right? Do I want, and there's two ends of the spectrum for you. So the more motion blur you have, the more you have that sensation of motion. So if you're doing like action photography or something, sometimes you might want some motion blur. If someone's swinging a baseball bat, you want that blur coming off the end of the bat, right? That will be achievable as you get closer and closer to, let's say like 1/30th of a second. And I would say 1/30th of a second is the minimum, the longest shutter speed you should use. The slowest shutter speed you should use, at least when you're holding the camera. And if you have a tripod or something, a lot of people will do long exposures. Long exposures, anything sort of longer than that range, 1/30th of a second. And they'll use it to capture night photography, which will have all the stars just even brighter, more vibrant skies at night. That's really useful for that purposes. But the more that you sort of go to that end of things, the more not only will your subjects have motion blur, but your hand will as well. So the little subtle movements in your hand, if you can't hold it quite steady, having a slower shutter speed will introduce that into the image, and it'll look bad. It'll look blurry. It will look not necessarily out of focus, but in the same kind of way, just degraded image quality. So that's something to avoid, and especially when you go below 1/30th of a second, it's unavoidable. I don't care if you think you have like the steadiest hands in the world. At a certain point, everyone has like little micro tremors in their hand that will introduce to the frame, especially if you're shooting on a longer lens. The more telephoto your lens is, the more camera shake you're going to have. So try to shoot, I would say 1/60th of a second is really good for action photography. You have some natural motion blur. When you're shooting video, a good rule of thumb is what's called the 180 degree rule. And 180 degrees refers to shutter angle, so it's more something for cinema cameras, because cinema cameras will use shutter angle, whereas hybrid cameras like DSLRs and stuff will still use shutter speed for video. But essentially, a 180 degree shutter angle means twice your frame rate is your shutter speed. And that's what looks natural for human motion. For instance, if you're shooting at 24 frames per second and you want a sort of natural motion blur to action, you would shoot at like 1/50th of a second, right? If you're shooting at 60 frames per second, you want to shoot at 1/20th of a second. So double that, and then 1 over double, basically, is going to be your shutter speed that you're using for that kind of natural motion blur. Alternatively, if you're shooting something like water or something, like a drop of water hitting, and you want to capture this sort of water splash frozen in time, and you don't want the blur, that you want it to be all of it to be super crisp. That kind of macro photography of water is really like using a very, very fast shutter speed can be really, really nice for that that time frozen effect. So again, it's a creative decision. It depends on what you want to do. But that's sort of the balancing act is like f-stop and shutter speed, right? Your aperture and your shutter speed are going to sort of work hand in hand to do these sorts of creative decisions. And the other creative decision you might want to do is like, is this going to be a balanced exposure? Is everything in the frame going to be sort of balanced? What am I exposing for? Am I exposing for the foreground, the sky, the background? What is going to be sort of the center of the focus? And there's what we call like a high key image and a low key image. If you're in a really, really dark room, you have the chiaroscuro, there's only like a rim light on your subject, right? Relying on auto exposure will not really work for you in that scenario, because auto exposure will try to do like a balanced image, and it will probably overexpose for what you're trying to do. If you're just trying to do like a silhouette, some really nice dark dark lighting, with just like the rim light, the dappled light on their face, that kind of thing is a low-key image, which means that you're going to want to expose sort of lower, at least as far as the automatic algorithm in the camera is concerned, than the camera would think you want to. So that's a low-key image, and then a high-key image would be like, let's say you're in you got a cyclic, you got a white screen, a big white screen behind you. You're shooting with like a beauty filter. You're doing a glamour shoot in there, and you've got a beauty dish, sort of reflecting all of this light onto their face, and you want it to be very look like heaven. Everything's white. Their face is white. It just looks really nice. That's a high key image, and again, that's going to be much different from like a balanced exposure. So that's another creative decision that you're going to make, and what aperture and what shutter speed you use are going to control the amount of light that gets into your image. So that's part of the balancing act. Again, so the third part of that triangle is the ISO, and that is going to sort of allow you to make those kinds of creative decisions, then crank up your ISO to help balance out the final product, to help support those creative decisions, rather than being a creative decision on its own. So if you're underexposed and you've got the right depth of field that you want, you've got the right motion blur that you want, then cranking up your ISO to match that will be good. But I would say, as a rule of thumb, keep your ISO as low as possible until you need to crank it up to support those creative decisions. The other factor to keep in mind when doing your exposure triangle is that aperture, the wider the aperture goes, the more light is going to be let in. Now, how does aperture work? How does the f-stop work? A theoretical f-stop of 1 would be completely wide open. The aperture blades on the inside of the lens open as wide as they can possibly go. I don't think that's like scientifically possible because the blades have to open, they have to fold sort of to open up. And I don't think it's possible to design blades that completely disappear in the lens. There are some people that use sort of like cheats to sort of achieve scientifically impossible f-stops below f1. We'll talk. Might cover that in a bit, but we're not going to cover that now. As essentially, an f-stop is a measurement of how wide it goes, and how is the numbering system on f? How does that work? The numbering system for f-stop, because it's a little bit confusing to people who don't know, and it's like, okay, f1 1.2, f 1.4, 1.8. 2, 2.8, like, why is it going up in these weird increments? The f-stop, and it's still confusing to me, but each f-stop is the previous f-stop multiplied by the square root of 2. Which, don't try and do the math, just memorize the f-stops. But square root of 2 is approximately 1.4. Square root of 2 times the square root of 2 is approximately 2. Square root of 2 times the square root of, it's approximately 1.8. I don't know. I'm not a mathematician, man. I'm just doing photography. You can do the math yourself and see what it is, but the important thing is that with every single stop, it's double the amount of light. And that goes for not just f-stop, but every stop of light in general. So stops are how we measure light, and a stop means double the amount of the previous stop of light. It doesn't look like double. So stops of light will look linear, even though they are pretty much exponential. And the reason they look linear is because the human eye is more sensitive to lower light situations. So as things get lower and lower, our eyes become more and more sensitive. That's why it seems like a linear sort of fall off of, if you look at a stop of light, like 10 stops of light next to each other on like a color checker or something, it's going to look like a grayscale, a linear grayscale. But it's not. It's double the amount of light. Knowing how those stops work, so if you're on ISO 100, which is probably the lowest, the base native ISO, as we call it, the lowest ISO that the camera is calibrated for, if you go one stop higher, it's going to be ISO 200. If you go one stop higher than that, it's ISO 400. You go one stop higher than that, it's ISO 800. So it doubles every single time. Same with the shutter speed. If you're shooting at 1/30th of a second, one stop lower than that is going to be 1/60th of a second. If you're shooting at 1/60th, one stop lower, again, lower meaning less light being let in, because a faster shutter speed is going to have less time for the light to get into the camera. So 1/60th to 120 to 240, it doubles every single time. The only exception to that is the f-stop, which is times the square root of 2, basically. Which, yeah, it's confusing. Just remember f-stops. It's not that hard. It's just a couple numbers, you know. And sometimes f-stops will be measured in half stops or third stops. So actually f1.2 is not a full stop down from f1.4, or a full stop brighter from f1.4. It's actually a half stop. But they manufacture lenses that are f1.2. They're very expensive. So the wider your aperture goes, the more expensive that lens is going to be, because it's harder and harder to manufacture blades that can open that wide. But also the shallower your depth of field is going to be, and the more light that's going to be let into your image. So we call it a faster lens because it's capable of letting in more light. And it will allow you to shoot at lower and lower light, which is useful for a lot of people. So that's a big consideration. And then yeah, the shutter speed. So that's sort of how you balance light and how you do the sort of creative, artistic decisions. Besides, obviously, there's a lot of art theory that goes into photography that's more past the technical stuff, like composition or color theory, lighting theory, which we'll actually talk a little bit about in this video. As far as the exposure settings on your camera and what to look for when you're buying a lens, that would be what you want to look for. So actually, when you're buying a lens, what's going to be listed is the focal length primarily. It'll say if it's a single focal length or a zoom, and it will also say probably the lowest, widest aperture that lens is capable of. That doesn't mean it's the only aperture that lens is capable of. It's just the widest it'll go. Again, because that's the hardest to manufacture. And if you see a lens that has actually 2 apertures listed, it's not because that's the aperture range that the blades can go. It's because it's probably a zoom lens, and at one part of the zoom it will be one aperture, and in another part of the zoom it will be another aperture. So as you zoom in further, the aperture will go it'll decrease in the amount of light, which is usually the case for some cheaper zoom lenses that are lower quality. But yeah, that'll help your purchasing decisions when you're trying to buy a lens for your camera. Another consideration when you're buying the camera itself will be that low light. Because ISO is a digital gain that is applied after the light hits the sensor, basically. What that means is as you start to crank that gain up, it introduces more and more digital noise to the signal. So the noise gets amplified the higher your ISO goes, which is a good reason if you're shooting in a lot of low light situations, you might want to invest in a newer camera, specifically one that has good low light capabilities, or alternatively invest in faster glass. So an f1.4, f1.2, even an f2.8 versus f4, f5.6, which is much cheaper to buy, but it will not get you the same depth of field. It will not help you in low light situations the same way a faster lens will. But yeah, some good recommendations for super fast or super good low light cameras. The one I'm shooting on right now, the R8, actually has exceptional low light for the price. The Sony A7S III is famously good for low light, specifically for video. There is some new cameras, and I would say not all modern cameras have good low light. Especially even in relation to cameras that came out 10, 15 years ago. If you compare, some of the offerings now have barely better low light than what came before. So it'll really depend on the camera itself, and you do your research in that respect. So if you know you're going to be doing a lot of low light situations, especially if you're doing like nightclubs or night photography, that kind of thing, low light will be a consideration for you. If you are specifically working in a studio environment where the lighting is very much controlled, you have some hot lights, or you're always shooting in daylight and you know you're not going to need that low light, it may be worthwhile to invest in a used full frame camera or something, that will really give you some nice images and still hold up to this day. Like for instance, this one right here. The 5D Mark II, legendary full-frame camera here. This one has pretty bad low-light capabilities, but if you give it enough light, if you give it enough light, good lighting situations, this one will shine. It will absolutely shine. It can take some amazing photos, and it still does 1080p video. So video is another consideration. We'll talk about that just a sec. But yeah, this body right here, I think you can get one for about $400 now. And it's a full frame camera, and full frame, it tends to be more expensive because the sensors are larger, they're harder to manufacture. It's probably a really great first full frame camera for someone who's on a budget, who doesn't care about low light situations and doesn't need maybe 4K video. It's a great option for that. Investing in some old cameras can be a really good idea, especially if you're on a budget. And you can invest in your full frame camera, get a nice older body, and then spend the rest of your money on some good glass, which is way more important. Good glass is going to be more important than a good camera body. And then you can upgrade your camera body later and still use your kit. For instance, the R8 that I'm working on right now, I'm adapting these EF lenses. I have the EF mount is the older mount that Canon used to do, and they're sort of moving away from it now with the new RF mount, the mirrorless mount. But I'm adapting pretty much flawlessly these older EF lenses to the RF body, which is great. And you can do the same thing with vintage lenses as well. Now, I do want to talk a bit about that because vintage lenses are probably the most bang for your buck in terms of just insane value for money that you're going to be able to get from any camera gear. Because you can actually pick up some amazing vintage lenses for like 30 to 50 bucks, But the downside, I want to talk about the downsides of that, and it's a trade-off, whether you're willing to trade a lack of autofocus, a lack of image stabilization built into the lens, and having to sort of manually focus and manually adjust aperture on your lens, versus the newer features like autofocus, image stabilization, that are only in the new lenses. Vintage lenses will require you to manually focus. You won't have that sort of assist feature of being able to just rely on the camera to focus for you. But I don't consider autofocus to be an essential camera feature. Unless you're doing something like sports photography, where you really want to continuously track your subject, and you need it to be in focus. You need to be quick. You don't have a second to sort of capture your subject, versus if you have a patient sort of workflow, if you're working in a situation that allows you to sort of patiently get the focus that you want, especially if you're doing like studio work or something, Yeah, you could invest in a lot of really good vintage glass that has a really nice character to it. There's a lot of vintage glass that has just this really nice filmic sort of cinematic look that a lot of modern glass, even though it's sharp, it doesn't really have that same sort of feel, that sort of really nice highlight roll off from stuff. So consider investing in vintage glass. It is well worth it for the money. And all you have to do is buy a little cheap adapter, which can usually be like 20 bucks. So if you are planning on buying a new camera body and you want to spend a lot of money on that camera body, as I would encourage you, don't spend all your money on the camera body. Get some good glass. But if you're going to spend the majority of your money on a camera body, you can get an adapter and get some cheap vintage glass that is still good glass. Cheap glass is not necessarily bad glass, but for new glass, usually cheap glass is worse, I would say. But vintage glass is amazing. There's like some really good hidden gems out there, and they're going for insanely cheap, like $30, $50, $100, even like $200. For like even the old Canon FD mount, you can get an L series lens. L is the designation for the expensive, very high quality glass that tends to be very, very good. You can get an L series lens for about $100 if you go with vintage glass. It's not possible if you go with the new stuff. So yeah, there's some great options for you there. The trade-off, you're losing that manual focus, you're losing image stabilization. Newer cameras will have something called IBIS, inbuilt image stabilization, or inbuilt image stabilization. It stabilizes things in the camera body. And then sort of stuff that's come out in the past 10 or 15 years will also have the IS sort of designation on the lens itself. So when you're buying lenses, you might see IS on the lens. That means that it's image stabilized in the lens. It will help to create a more stable image. Those two types of image stabilization, I would say, are way more useful as a video feature. It will help with when you get to slower shutter speeds, or you're shooting with the longer telephoto lenses where you super telephoto and everything's a little bit shaky. It will help in those situations, but mainly it's a video feature. It is marketed towards video professionals that want really good quality video. And I would say my camera, the R8, does not have inbuilt image stabilization. It has digital image stabilization. It's pretty good, but if you're shooting video, that may be a consideration for you. Or if you're shooting video, you may want to invest in a camera gimbal. If you're buying a new mirrorless camera or something, you can easily just put it on a camera gimbal, get really, really smooth, sort of Steadicam footage that looks really nice and professional. If you're doing that kind of work anyways, it may be worth it just to have a gimbal. I don't consider inbuilt image stabilization to be an essential feature, even for video work, because there's alternative ways to sort of get that smooth look. But yeah, that's a consideration, and it's also the trade-off if you're using vintage lenses. So let's talk about lighting, because lighting is a super important part of photography, and one that gets underappreciated by people who are just starting, because they're learning all the exposure and stuff. They're learning to do things sharp, or get the right lenses. And they may spend a lot of money on their camera body or even their camera lenses, but they don't spend any on lighting. And I think that's a mistake. Unless you're shooting out in the daytime. But still knowing good lighting principles is important. So there's stuff like, probably the most simple lighting scenarios you can think of are one-point lighting, meaning one light source that is sort of filling your image. That's what we call a key light. Right? The key light to your image is the main light source to your image that is lighting your subjects. These principles are going to be a bit different if you're not shooting people. If you're shooting interiors and stuff, a lot of times you're going to be doing real estate photography. The lighting is going to be an architectural thing versus a sort of like portrait lighting. But 1-point lighting, one light source, there's a lot you can do with 1-point lighting. 2-point lighting, 2 light sources. You might have a key light, which is lighting your actor's face from one side, and it's lighting up, and then you have your fill light on the other side, which is just adding a little bit of fill. I think it's actually the opposite. I think it's key light here and fill light here at this point. Getting that sort of key light and fill light together, a two light scenario is probably the most common that you'll end up with. And then the third, the 3-point lighting, maybe you've got a rim light, you've got the light around your silhouette, you've got rim light is called rim light because it creates a little rim of light because the light is sort of behind your subject, or sort of back into the sides of your subject. It's creating a nice little sort of lighting around the edges. And then finally, you might want to put like a hair light above your subject. But I'd urge you to look into different scenarios for different types of lighting. Lighting is not that expensive, and it's not hard to do. It's not hard to do well with cheap lights. So get something. You can get little pocket RGB lights, or if you're working in a studio, there's some cheap stuff out there. But color temperature will matter for those lights. So color temperature for those lights are going to be measured in Kelvin. Kelvin is a measure of the white balance. Essentially everything from sort of candlelight to like tungsten to daylight to anything bluer than that. Daylight tends to be very blue, tungsten tends to be very yellowish, candlelight gets almost orange. So getting the right lighting for the right scenario is a very good idea. There's RGB lights nowadays that can do some really cool like colored effects that are not necessarily within the Kelvin range, but can get you this sort of cyberpunky kind of feel. They're really nice. So yeah, look into that. And a lot of lights will be listed as bicolor, which means that they go from Kelvin to daylight, which is a very good range to have because when you're dealing with Kelvin, you're dealing with warmer lights, normally something interior, and then daylight being bluer, so you have more versatility in that range. As far as brightness goes, brightness will be very, very important for those lenses. That's measured in lumens or lux. Lumens is the sheer amount of output of light that the light is putting out. Lux is measured at a certain distance. So usually it's measured at either 0.5 meters or 1 meter away. That's what the lux rating of a light will be. I find that lux ratings are way more useful than lumens because they tell you at 1 meter how bright is that going to be on your subject. So the lux of, let's say, broad daylight will be about 100,000 to 150,000 in midday, which is an insanely high amount. Can you overpower the sun in that scenario? No. You can't overpower it. Like, there's some lights out there that are very expensive that you'll be able to maybe stand a chance of overpowering the sun. But usually when you're in broad daylight, you will be using the sun as your key light. You might be using another light as your fill. But you want bright lights if you're shooting in daylight. You want super bright lights if you're shooting in daylight. Pocket RGB lights are not going to cut it. Okay? You will want maybe like a 120D or something, as a lot of people are shooting with 120Ds. Those are pretty bright. But those are also quite expensive. Yeah, the brighter the light, the more expensive it's going to be. GVM has some really bright stuff that's actually quite affordable. But if you're shooting in a studio or something where you're just sort of using blackout curtains, that not letting light through the window, light through the window can be, I believe it's like as much as 1,500 lux through an open window, maybe overcast or something. So you can get lights that are 1,500 lux at 1 meter or something. But if you're like, let's say you're 1 meter away from that window and you have a light 1 meter away that's 1,500 lux, you might be able to balance it out with the light coming into the window, which is actually what's happening right now. So So that's pretty cool. Knowing the lighting that you're using, even if you're going to be shooting in daylight, just know how to use the sun to your advantage. Put it at the right angle to your subject. I heard someone talking about like the 90-degree rule, which is a good lighting scenario for sunlight, where you have sort of the sunlight to one side of your subject, and you're facing the subject dead on, and then it's to 90 degrees of your subject from there. That's a good way to do it. I know there's a photographer, Helmut Newton, basically always exposed. He was a famous glamour photographer, always exposed with the sun over his right shoulder. And that was how he always got his, glamorous sort of key light. So that is a good lighting scenario, is to have the light over your right shoulder. I would look into butterfly lighting, look into Rembrandt style lighting, look into clamshell lighting. There's a lot of different lighting scenarios that will give you some really good looks for your portrait photography, your glamour photography, and knowing how to light your subject is really important. Lighting goes a long way, much more than much more than the camera body also, So if you have a good lens, you have a good camera, but your lighting is absolute garbage, it's going to be garbage. If you have a good body, you have a shit lens, your lighting's good, it might be okay, but the lens is also really important, so getting a good lens, getting good lighting, really important. Finally, let's talk about video, because video is a really important feature that a lot of people are gravitating towards. Some of you might want to do a bit of video on the side. Some of you might have a video focus. Some of you might be doing a bit of both. And some of you just might want to do stills. How much you want to do is probably going to depend. The camera you buy will depend on how much you want to do with it video-wise, right? If you're going to buy, like, for instance, the A7S III, very, very good camera for video specifically and for low light specifically. It shines in low light on video. It is not the best still camera. It actually has a very low megapixel count, which is not the best for stills. Normally, anything like 20 megapixels and up, I would say it's fine. The sensor matters more than the megapixels. I have my Xiaomi, camera here, or Xiaomi phone here. The camera on here is 108 megapixels. This is not as good as the camera I'm shooting with, or the camera there. It's not going to be as good. So megapixel count actually doesn't matter so much until you get below 20 megapixels. Maybe it starts to not be as good. And the only exception to that rule, I would say, where megapixels actually matter, is if you're shooting for something, you need to blow it up super wide. You're going to put it on like a billboard, or you're going to, do a gigantic poster on someone's wall. Like, if you're shooting at that size, maybe megapixel count will matter more. But for most cases, it won't. It's only when things get really, really gigantic, real-world scale that, in prints or something, that it starts to matter. But as far as video goes, 4K may be something you want to look into. So there's a lot of new 4K cameras out there. It's starting to become a sort of standard feature for mirrorless or DSLRs. The mirrorless tends to be the way that they're going now. Like, Canon has kind of stopped producing the DSLR line. They're shifting towards all mirrorless. Mirrorless is kind of the future of cameras now. It doesn't mean that there's not really good options in the DSLR range. I don't consider there to be like a huge difference, besides the size of the camera, as DSLRs tend to be bigger. And also maybe the shutter. The DSLRs will have a mechanical shutter, versus a lot of mirrorless lenses will have what's called an electronic shutter. Now that is relevant to video, and it's also relevant to photography, especially if you're doing really fast motion photography, because a mechanical shutter is probably going to be fine. Especially if it's a global shutter, it's going to be able to capture everything in frame all at once. But an electronic shutter will have a problem that's called rolling shutter. And rolling shutter means that as you start to move the camera forward and backwards really quickly, because it's scanning sort of the lines of the image from top to bottom, it can't always keep up with that movement, and it'll start scanning the lines, and you'll notice that the image sort of shears and warps at the bottom. The rolling shutter effect is really pronounced in some cameras. For instance, this R8 that I have has a rolling shutter problem when you're shooting with the electronic shutter. It also has what's called a first curtain shutter, which is kind of like a pseudo mechanical shutter that eliminates a lot of that rolling shutter effect. But you'll be able to shoot at like 40 frames per second with stills with the electronic shutter, but only 6 frames per second with the first curtain shutter. So that's a consideration, especially if you're doing action photography. The rolling shutter effect is important, and also if you're doing video. So if you have a camera that can eliminate the rolling shutter, if you're doing video and you're doing fast movements with your camera, that's something you may want to look into. Again, 4K may or may not be a must for you. I don't think that everyone needs 4K, honestly. There's a huge push to it nowadays. You can still take really amazing quality video with 1080p. This one right here still takes amazing 1080p quality video. If you're delivering to YouTube, especially if you're delivering to like Instagram or something, you don't need 4K. No one's going to be looking at it like 4K. Like they won't even notice on their phone, you know. So if you're always delivering to smaller screens, it may be less of a consideration for you to get that 4K. Beyond 4K, I would say people are very guilty of what I like to call like the bike shedding effect. Bike shedding is a term that was coined, I forget exactly who said it, but they were attending a town hall meeting and there was, sort of talking about what are the priorities of that community, and there was a nuclear power plant that got none of the attention because arguably the most important thing is to figure out the nuclear power plant, but no one talked about that. They spent the entire time talking about bike sheds, the unimportant details, right? So when people focus on really, really unimportant details that I think are less and less relevant as camera technology gets better and better, people focus on smaller and smaller, less and less important details when it comes to like actually getting the highest quality image. So when you're talking about, I think 4K is the limit. 4K is a great resolution. People have 4K TVs. I think most people don't need 6K or 8K. There's even 12K cameras out there now. Most people will not need that. And the only advantage I can see of maybe getting a 6K camera or something is that you can shoot in 6K and then crop in the final product in 4K and still have a full 4K resolution. The only other advantage I can see would be sort of oversampling a 6K or 8K image to a 4K result, which will result in a sharper image in 4K, even though you're still delivering in 4K. For instance, this camera here is oversampled from 6K to a 4K image. Very good, very sharp image. So it's sharper than other 4K sensors would be, which is really good. And that's probably enough for most people. In fact, just a 4K sensor on its own would probably be enough for most people. If you're shooting 1080p, if you know that you don't need the 4K video, I would recommend getting an older camera for your first one, just because it's so much cheaper. Like again, the 5D Mark II is $400. If you're not shooting video at all, the 5D Mark I, the 5D Classic, is an insanely good camera for the price, which you can pick up for about $150. It's a full frame camera that shoots really, 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 really great stills. Again, not great with low light. That's still a problem, when you get the older cameras. You could get a T3i for the same price that does shoot 1080p video for about $150. And I actually wouldn't recommend buying the later Rebel series, the T8i, T7i. think the 8i actually introduced like 4K video, but it's not worth it for the price, in my opinion. If you really want an APS-C that has 4K video, I would recommend either the R50 or the new R100. Those are pretty good. Is it the ZV-E10 for Sony? Those are pretty good 4K video capable APS-C cameras. Yeah, those are about I think $500 to $800 range. So yeah, it depends on what you want to do, but those are some recommendations for you. I don't really know a whole lot about Nikon or Fujifilm. I know there's some good options out there, but look into it, because I don't think the brand matters so much, except for the fact that you're getting into an ecosystem, and the lenses that you use will be tailored to that ecosystem. But there's a lot of competition, and I think the good thing is that every single couple of years, camera manufacturers will come out and create the killer camera that puts all the other ones to shame, and then Sony will make the A7S with the crazy light capabilities, and Canon claps back with their their R6 or whatever. Like there's competition to the point where every manufacturer sort of has their time to shine and create the one that's better than everyone else, and it just means that there's good cameras all around. Yeah, video capabilities, 4K is something to consider. The frame rate that you shoot at maybe was something to consider, because maybe you want to do 4K 60 if you're doing a little bit of slow motion. 4K 60 is really popular if you want to shoot at 4K 60 and then deliver in 4K 24 frames per second, which tends to be like the cinematic sort of frame rate that people love. But the 60 allows you to go a little bit slow motion here and there, like do a slow motion ease where it's like normal human speed and slow it down a little bit, then come back. I don't find the 60 to be super useful in slow motion. It can get you almost like 3 times slow motion. But some of the newer cameras now have like 120 frames per second. This one has 180 frames per second in 1080p. So that's a consideration, and you will have to sacrifice the 4K for the 120 frames per second. But that's a compromise I'm willing to make. But yeah, that's a consideration if you're getting to video specifically. Again, low light capabilities may be more of an issue if you're dealing with video, because you can run a denoiser on grainy stills, but it's harder to run a denoiser on video. Those are all sort of considerations that you might take into account when buying your first camera. Let's see if there's anything else. As far as the photography community goes, guys, I know like you're just starting out here and you want to ask a lot of questions on like Reddit and Discord and stuff. The photography community is one of the most toxic art communities that I've ever been a part of. There is people who are very, very egotistical, people who are very, very unfriendly and have like superiority complexes. And I think the reason for that is because photography is such a subjective medium, more so than other artistic mediums as well, because you may be shooting a high key image and people say, oh, that's overexposed, like, no, it was intentional, I shot that way on purpose. You might be exposing for like the best skin tones and someone's like, your sky's blown out. That's again, it's priorities. What is your priority when you're shooting an image? That's another thing I should probably talk about is dynamic range. For cameras have a certain dynamic range. Again, dynamic range, like all other things regarding light, are measured in stops, right? So stops are half the light a stop down, basically, right? Dynamic range is a measurement of how many stops of light your camera can conceivably capture in a single image and still look clean, right? Now that is that's an important feature of a camera, because a lot of times you'll be exposing for someone's skin tones,
and the sky will be blown out behind them. If you've got a bright sky and a person who's in shadow, it's going to be hard to expose for both of those things at the same time. You might end up with one of them blown out. And generally, if you're shooting a portrait, you want to expose for the skin tones first and then deal with sort of bringing the sky down, maybe in post, right? So one sort of solution to this, especially if you're working on a older camera that might have less dynamic range, is to shoot raw when you're shooting for stills. So shooting raw is it's a really important feature. Pretty much all DSLRs have this feature. If they don't, I wouldn't use it for stills because it allows you to sort of grade things in post way better than if you're just shooting JPEGs. If you're just shooting JPEGs, you're going to end up hitting a wall very quickly of how far you can push the color grade on that image or color corrections. If the sky is overexposed on a JPEG, you're not getting that back. If it's a little bit overexposed on a RAW, you might get some of that back. You might be able to get some highlight recovery or shadow recovery. And so raw, what a raw image is just the raw data that's hitting the sensor, and that is related to the bit depth of the file, right? So when you're talking about an 8-bit image, which is what a JPEG is, an 8-bit image has about 16 million possible colors for every single pixel. It's a lot of colors, but it's not enough colors to sort of have some wiggle room in post, which is why people shoot why people will shoot RAW, or they'll shoot RAW and JPEG so they can have the JPEGs for like super fast delivery if they need to just hand it over to the client right there and then as is. But they have the RAWs where you can sort of push it further because RAW files are about like a 14-bit image. Now, for video professionals, one of the most important considerations when buying a camera is the bit depth of the video. Because we have what's called 10-bit video, for every bit that you add, you sort of get an exponentially greater number of colors that your camera can sort of use for each pixel. So 8-bit is 16 million. I believe that 10-bit is like 1 billion colors, and then 12-bit is like, I think 6 billion or 8 billion or something, and like 14-bit is like a trillion, something like that. It goes up pretty quickly. Because the RAW files have all the raw sensor data, and I don't think that they really capture, or they don't really fully make use of the 14-bit range. I don't think. I have no idea. Camera manufacturers will know better than I do. But it's quite a lot of space to sort of store all the color depth of everything that's sort of hitting the sensor. It's more than the eye can see. It's what we'd call sort of high dynamic range. Actually, RAW files are not technically high dynamic range, or they're higher dynamic range than the JPEGs. But you would have more dynamic range to work with if you're shooting in a log profile in 10-bit. Now, log is sort of a color profile that sort of flattens all of the colors out. It sort of reduces the contrast of everything so that more of the shadows sit closer to middle gray and more of the highlights sit closer to middle gray. And you're sort of squeezing everything down so it fits better into a 10-bit file. Because the way that we see things, what we'd call Rec 709, which is the normal way that things are displayed on a monitor with the sort of punchy contrast that we like to see, is not necessarily the most efficient way to store that in the file, which log, it tends to be one of the most efficient ways to sort of store it in a 10-bit file. Log is useful, this sort of flat profile, as we call it, it's useful only if you are dealing with 10-bit or above footage. Because it's essentially worthless if you're shooting 8-bit video.
don't worry about it, being a feature if you're just shooting 8-bit video anyways. But 10-bit video, 10-bit log especially, will be very, very useful, and it will give you not the same amount of flexibility of sort of color correcting and color grading a raw still image, but if you're shooting with 10-bit video, you can get a lot of the same leeway, a lot of the same, you can push it much, much further in post than you would if you were shooting 8-bit video, or if you're shooting in a, the standard profile for your camera. Additionally, there's a lot of LUTs. LUTs are called lookup table. LUTs are lookup tables. They are sort of almost like a filter, like a better version of the Instagram filters and stuff. LUTs are used by a lot of video professionals, and most LUTs are designed around, or a lot of LUTs are designed around the log profile, being able to take advantage of the log profile and give it a certain look, right? So that's what LUTs are really good for. So if you're shooting a log, just know that there's a lot of stuff out there for you to use. A lot of LUTs that'll work for that. So yeah, it's a good feature to have in a camera if you're doing specifically video. Whereas still cameras, you're kind of covered by just like the legacy technology, the technology that's been out there. Raw images have been out there for decades, and they're great. Just shoot raw when you're shooting stills. Unless you really don't want to have to deal with stuff in post, then you can maybe just shoot JPEGs and stuff, and then you just have the JPEGs. But I shoot both. So yeah, 10-bit video, log. Oh, and raw video. Raw video is a thing now. It is in some cameras. It is a very expensive feature usually. It's only in the really higher end cameras. If you are shooting video only, one of the best bang for your buck options is going to be the Blackmagic Pocket cinema cameras. They have the Blackmagic Pocket 4K for about $1,200, and they have the Blackmagic Pocket 6K for about $2,500. And they are amazing. The color science is amazing. Again, as the name suggests, they shoot 4K and 6K respectively. But not only do they shoot 4K and 6K, but they shoot 4K and 6K with raw video, which is essentially the same advantage that raw stills have, but applied to video. It's actually 12-bit. It's not the full 14 bits that the sort of the Canon raw images will have. But 12 bits is what we'd call it's high dynamic range. You're going to be able to get a ton of dynamic range. Squeeze your image, get the sky exposed with the foreground and everything, and just get everything exposed well, and make the highlights and shadows fit better, and get so much more detail in your shadows, so much more detail in your highlights. So raw video is amazing. Blackmagic is amazing for delivering it at that price point, because most cinema cameras that have those features are $10,000, $30,000, even $100,000. Like the RE Alexa, which very popular camera for directors because of its really nice look, the Alexa look. Or the Red cameras, which are also insanely expensive cinema cameras. So Blackmagic is directly competing with them at a much, much lower price point. So I really recommend that. They do not really shoot stills, so that's the trade-off. If you're going specifically for a cinema camera, if you're going specifically for video, that's a great fucking option. I 100% recommend it if you're not interested in stills. So yeah. I think that's about everything. I know I covered a lot of stuff here. So yeah, go back and rewatch it if you missed anything, if you forget stuff. Let me know in the comments what you want to know more about, or what you feel like you didn't get enough of, and maybe I'll do another video on it next time. Hopefully that'll give you like the complete crash course in how to pick your camera, how to speak the language, and how to sort of know what you're getting into, and pick your niche. Pick what specific genre you're doing, and sort of cater your tool set around that. Again, at the end of the day, just tools, man.
There's nothing to sort of feel superior about or argue about, because at the end of the day, it's just tools. So have a great day, and see you guys later. Peace.